Take your Bibles and turn to the book of Esther. All right, the book of Esther. All right. We will be doing a little bit of groundwork to establish our theme this morning, but this morning I'd like to talk about divine appointments. Divine appointments. An appointment is an act of appointing a time or a place for a designated purpose. A time or a place for a designated purpose. So there's many appointments that we make very naturally. We make doctor's appointments, make dentist appointments, lunch appointments, fill in the blank. We make appointments where we get out our calendar or we get out our phone and we punch it in the time and the place of where we're supposed to go. Because what happens if we don't, right? What happens if we don't write it on the calendar or put the reminder in our phone? We forget, and we miss our appointment. And I've missed some appointments before, unfortunately. It's happened. I actually almost missed an appointment with my endocrinologist this last Monday because I forgot about it. But fortunately, on that day, I had a reminder that reminded me to make my appointment. So I didn't miss it, and it was a fantastic and a very profitable appointment for me. When we make an appointment, it is for a purpose, and it is in our best interest to meet that appointment, to fill it, so that we can gain the purpose that we intended to accomplish. This last week, a number of us, as I mentioned this morning, went down to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and we saw the Sight and Sound production, Queen Esther. Who here was there? Go ahead and raise your hand. And so if you're in the back, you can see how many, even that are just here today, went. It was a fantastic time, a fantastic opportunity for us to go. If you ever have the chance to go to Sight and Sound, I would highly recommend it because it's just awe-inspiring. For those who have been involved in Mystery Bible Character Sundays, right, Steve Lilly? You go down there and you're just blown away. And you truly appreciate what goes into such a production. But it's fantastic. For those of you who have been there for the first time just this last week, it was kind of neat to see your eyes get big and wide at some of the moments as perhaps you saw and experienced some things that you didn't expect. But the show, the production this time was Queen Esther. And I want to look at the story of Queen Esther, at least up to a certain point, and stop and consider that we don't just make appointments for ourselves in life, whether it be to go to the dentist or whether it be to go out with someone and have coffee, but God actually makes appointments for us as well. God has some divine appointments in our life that he would like us to fill. And my encouragement to you this morning will be don't miss these appointments. Don't miss these appointments. We're going to establish the story, and then I'm going to give you three very basic and very simple precepts regarding not missing these divine appointments. But I want to take you through Esther and be ready just to turn the pages and to read the verses as we go, because the story is so important, and it speaks so well for itself. It speaks so well for itself. Leading up to Esther, understand this, that the Jews were led away into the Babylonian captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar when Jerusalem was besieged by the Babylonians in approximately 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar's son Belshazzar reigned in his father's stead, and his kingdom was divided and given to the Medes and Persians when King Cyrus of Persia defeated Babylon in 539 BC. Some of these things we read about in the scriptures, in Ezra and in Daniel, of what took place during these times. Daniel chapter 5, verse 31 tells us that Darius the Median took the kingdom at the age of about 62 years old, and he reigned from 522 to 486 BC. Darius' son, Ahasuerus, or more widely known as Xerxes. Now, some of us who were in the play, when we saw the king come out and they labeled him or recognized him as Xerxes, we kind of took a double take and said, wait a minute, who is that? I'm a little confused here. In the Bible, this king is mentioned as Ahasuerus, but historically he is also known as Xerxes, Xerxes the Great. And the situation here is that he reigned in his father's stead from 486 to 465 BC. This is the time of Esther that we read about, 486 to 465 BC, approximately that much time before the life of Christ. Now, Ahasuerus' throne was in Shushan. And for those of us who were at the play, we also took a double take on that because it was understood that his palace and his kingdom was in Susa. This, again, is another name for the place called Shushan. So we have Ahasuerus reigning in Shushan or Susa, and Xerxes being the king therein. This is where we pick it up in Esther chapter 1. Now read with me and let's familiarize ourselves with the story as we go through. We first see in Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, it says, "Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus," this is Ahasuerus which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces, "that in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even in 180 days." Now, I don't know if you can imagine having to celebrate. I can't. We come here and we do an Easter celebration breakfast, over just a span of a couple hours, and I'm toast. Like, I'm done. That's enough celebrating already. Let's go home and take a nap. These guys celebrated for 180 days to see the glory of Ahasuerus' kingdom, to see all of his power, to see everything, all of his wealth. Look at what it says in verses 10 through 12. "During this celebration, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass." I don't know if I'd want that name, Carcass, right? I don't want to be a carcass. "The 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, he commanded these to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains, and therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned within him." And so here we have the king who has a very fair and beautiful queen, Vashti, and not only that, but evidently has a great crown to wear upon her head. And in addition to showing all of his kingdom, he would like to bring her out so all of the princes and the powers and the people present could see her beauty and to know that she was his queen. And what happens here we see in Esther chapter 1, verses 15 through 21, where it says, let's read in verse 13. "Then the king said to the wise men which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment. And the next unto him was Carshena and Shethar and Matha, Tarshish, Maris, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face and which sat the first in the kingdom. They said, What shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to the law? Because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. Now, fair warning, what we're about to read here is not politically correct. All right, this is going to be things that wouldn't sit well with a whole lot of individuals in society today. It says this in verse 17, For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes, when it shall be reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall all the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. So all the princes, the king himself, and all the husbands in the land are really starting to get worried here. They're starting to think, oh my goodness, our wives are going to see the boldness and the audacity of the queen herself, and they're going to start treating us the same way that the queen is treating the king. And they would have nothing of this. Now, whether this is appropriate or not, that is for another day to discuss and to debate. This is the response in verse 19. It says, if it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. And the saying pleased the king. And the princes and the king did according to the word of Memucan. So here is this plan that they have derived that will put all of the wives in the kingdom in their place, and will bring them to a point where they will honor their husbands as they would see appropriate and fit. Let's go to Esther chapter 2, and look at what it says in verse 2. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan, the palace, to the house of the woman, unto the custody of Hegi, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the woman. And let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. As is often said, this was the very first bachelorette, or it would be bachelor, that ever took place, for those of you perhaps who watched that show. But all of these virgins in the land are going to be paraded before the king. And again, I mean, this seems crazy and it seems wild, but they actually do it nowadays for entertainment purposes. But they are all going to be paraded before the king, and the one who the king finds pleasure in, whether it be because of beauty or whether it be because of love, whatever it might be, and chooses, this one is going to be made queen in Vashti's place. This is where Esther enters the story. Look at what it says in verse 5. Now in Shushan the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. Now, these are some details that you want to remember. But to understand and know and recognize here that Mordecai and Hadassah, who we know to be Esther, are cousins. They are cousins. And we don't know what happened to Esther's parents, but in some capacity, they lost their lives, whether they were killed or maybe taken in the siege of Jerusalem or just died of some sickness, we don't know. But Hadassah, unfortunately, Esther, grew up without the presence of her parents and was taken in lovingly by her cousin Mordecai, who loved her as his own daughter. That was Esther's family. And now look at what it says here. Let's skip down to verse 15. It says, now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the woman, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her, as we remember that she was fair and beautiful. She needed nothing to enhance who she was. Now, she was one of those who was just sweet and beautiful, not in countenance and appearance, but in spirit as well. The beauty of holiness as the Bible calls it. As I have often and will continue to try to convince my daughters, that's what's more important than outward beauty is inward beauty. This is something that Esther had. And this is something that was unmistakable. And all those that looked upon her, she found favor in their sight. And not only in their sight, but as we keep reading here, in the king's as well. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women. And she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Now notice in verse 20, though, it says, Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. So we see as the story develops here, we see Esther is chosen as queen. She takes Vashti's place, but yet all throughout this ordeal, Mordecai has instructed and charged Esther not to reveal her identity, who she is. In other words, he said, don't tell them that you're a Jew. Don't tell them that you are those who are of the captivity of the nation of Israel. Keep that to yourself, because Esther is concerned and fears for her safety and her well-being if this were to be revealed. Now I know that in the play, for those of you who went to see the play, that the idea was given that the name Esther meant what? What was the meaning of Esther? A star. That may be accurate in some capacity. I don't know. I don't know if they took liberties. But a more true and accurate meaning of the word Esther is actually hidden. If you look that up, you look up the Hebrew word, Esther means to be hidden or to be concealed. And Esther, whose birth name was Hadassah, her name was changed to Esther, and she herself, in very real truth, was hidden. Her own identity, her own kindred, her own race, who she was at her core was hidden so that she could experience what this circumstance was that was brought into her life. And Mordecai charged her, don't tell anybody. And I even wonder who gave her the name Esther if it was not even Mordecai himself, as many of us saw in the play. Now look at what it says in Esther chapter 3, verse 1, because the story takes a little bit of a turn here. It says, after these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. Now I want you to take your Bibles and turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 15 real quick. This man Haman comes into the kingdom and finds favor in the sight of King Ahasuerus and is elevated to be above all others in the kingdom, for whatever purpose and cause that the king gave to him. This man was Haman, the son of Hammedatha, and he was an Agagite. He was an Agagite. This is something that was not missed in the play, and that was an integral part of the story, because when we look back to 1 Samuel chapter 15, I want you to see what it says in verses 1 through 3. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 1 through 3. As we enter into this part of Jewish history, Saul is the king, and in verse 1 it says, Samuel, who is the priest, also said unto Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over the people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken thou unto the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. Now this was the instruction that was given to Saul. This is what we understand, that Saul, because of the Lord's hatred for Amalek, because of what Amalek did to the nation of Israel, said, go and smite them and utterly destroy them. He was instructed to destroy all of them. Man, woman, child, beast, everything, without any exception. What happened? Look at verses 8 and 9. Jump down to verse 8 and 9. It says, look at verse 7. And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until thou comest to shore, that is over against Egypt. And he took, who did he take there? Agag the king. He took Agag the king of the Amalekites alive and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatlings, and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. So who we see here as the king of the Amaleks is King Agag. Haman is the son of Hammedatha, who was an Agagite. Haman, in some capacity, whether it be by blood or in some citizenship of recognition, is of the seed and offspring of King Agag. Now, if anybody has something, has aught against the nation of Israel and the Jews, it might be someone who was of King Agag, who was an Agagite. Because look at what happens in verses 32 and 33 of 1 Samuel chapter 15. It says, Then said Samuel, Bring hither to me Agag the king of the Amalekites, because Saul was reprimanded and rebuked and reproved for what he had done, not utterly destroying the Amalekites. And Agag the king of the Amalekites, and Agag came unto him delicately, and Agag said, Surely the bitterness of death is past. And Samuel said, As thy sword hath made woman childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women. And Samuel hewed Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Some pretty intense stuff that goes on in the Old Testament there, that's for sure. But here we see that not only were the Amalekites destroyed, but King Agag, who Haman is a descendant of, was hewed in pieces by Samuel. Now, we don't know the story or the history of Haman or how he came to where he was in the province and in Shushan and in King Ahasuerus' palace, but this is who we're dealing with back in Esther. The one whose nation was destroyed at the hands, and whose kindred before him and whose forefathers were destroyed at the hands of the Israelites. Now, back in Esther chapter 3, as we come down to the point of the story, Esther chapter 3, look at what it says in verse 2 after Haman is introduced. It says that all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. So Haman had such position and status in the kingdom that the king actually commanded that whenever he would enter into the gate, that people would bow before him and give him reverence. But there was one person who refused to do that, and that was Mordecai. And not only was it Mordecai, but it was Mordecai the Jew. Look at what it says in verse 3. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. Now, for those of you who were in Sunday school, you want to know why Haman was full of wrath? Because all he cared about was himself. He thought that he was something special. He wanted the preeminence for himself. He had the Diotrephes complex, Haman had. And so because someone actually refused to bow to him, and appropriately so, this being Mordecai the Jew, Haman's wrath built up inside him, and he was livid. He couldn't believe it. Look at what it says in verse 6. And this is what happens because of pride. This is what happens because of strife and vainglory. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy not just Mordecai, but all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. Now, it's no small thing that that Haman didn't just want Mordecai dead. He wanted the Jews to be destroyed, just like his kindred, just like his nation was destroyed at the hand of the Jews. And this was a perfect opportunity for him. Now, look at what it says in verse 8. It says, "And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite." Notice what it says there. The Jews' enemy. Not just Mordecai's enemy, but the Jews' enemy. And it says in verse 11, "And the king said unto Haman, The silver is given to thee, the people also do with them as it seemeth good to thee. Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province according to the writing thereof. And to every people after their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus was it written and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by posts into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey." Boy, isn't this sweet revenge for Haman? Isn't this sweet revenge where it was instructed that his nation and the Amalekites were to be utterly destroyed? Not just man, but woman, child, and beast. And here Haman has the opportunity to exact revenge on the Jews by bringing destruction not only to maybe the men and to the warriors and to those that would cause a threat, but to men, woman, and child, young and old, everybody. And here Haman is having the exact revenge that he so desires. Look at what it says in verse 14. "The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people that they should be ready against that day. The posts went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink." Notice this, and keep this in the back of your head, "But the city Shushan was perplexed." Everybody in Shushan read this decree and said, wait a minute, what's going on? What is this decree? They knew who it was. They knew it was to be the Jews that were to be destroyed. There was a good history, and there was a good relationship between the Jews and between the Medes and the Persians. It was King Cyrus himself who ordered the temple to be rebuilt and who had a favorable relationship with the Jewish people and the Jewish nation and was favorable to their relation. And the people of Shushan are thinking, wait a minute, what is going on here? Not only that, but look at what it says in Esther chapter 4. When Mordecai perceived all that was done in verse 1, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. And you have to appreciate the plight of the Jews here. Imagine if there was a decree, if there was a law that was passed in our community, and this law was passed against Calvary Heights Baptist Church, that on such a day, on such a month, in this year, 2021, that our community members would converge on Calvary Heights Baptist Church on some Sunday morning when we were gathered together to meet and to worship the Lord, to destroy us. Not just man and woman, husband and wife, father and mother, but son and daughter and child and all those precious souls that are right below us right now as we speak. Imagine what we would think and what we would experience, and the horror and the sadness. And look at what it says there, the great mourning among the Jews and the fasting and the weeping and the wailing. They are begging God, please don't let this happen. With fasting and with sackcloth and ashes, save us from this destruction. Save us, or we will be destroyed, we and our families and our sons and our daughters. Now, jump down to verse 7, Esther chapter 4, verse 7. Now, isn't that what we would do? Wouldn't we beg God for help? Wouldn't we beg God for salvation? Wouldn't we take it so seriously that we would perhaps put all other cares of our life aside, and we would do everything that we could to ask for God's mercy and salvation and deliverance? And our anticipation and question would be, where will the deliverance come from? Who will save us? Look at what it says in verse 7. Esther finds out about Mordecai's situation and how he is in sackcloth and ashes in the king's gate. And this is not something that you would want to do, because you would be in danger of your life if the king would find out. And Esther hears about this, and she actually sends to Mordecai to learn of what is happening. And in verse 7 it says, Mordecai told him, the messenger that Esther sends to him, of all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews, to destroy them. Also he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and to make requests before him for her people. Mordecai is saying, wait a minute. We have someone who has the king's ear. And Esther, it's you. And Mordecai says, Esther, go into the king and ask for our help and for our deliverance. Verse 9 says, and Hatak came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. There's only a problem here, though. In verse 10 it says, Esther spake unto Hatak and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the provinces, the king's provinces, do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. Esther says, I'm sorry, but I don't know if I can help here. If I go in unto the king, it's been 30 days since the king has called me to come unto him. If I go in uninvited and unannounced, it could be my life. He may not extend the scepter to me. What a husband-wife relationship, huh? You know what that's like? That's like watching the Buffalo Bills on a Sunday afternoon. And right, the wife knows better than to go in there and to disrupt the husband's entertainment purposes, especially when the Bills are driving for a touchdown. And if there is some situation where the wife has to step in there, she's just only hoping, that maybe he'll extend forth his hand and say, it's okay, I mean, it's a type of life that we just can't even comprehend or understand. But Esther's in a pretty tough spot here. She tells Mordecai, I don't know what I can do. Now notice what it says here in verse 12. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Now that was the introduction. Here is our text. It says in verse 13, then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. Don't forget, Esther, you're a Jew too. And this ultimately cannot be hidden forever. Don't think that you're going to escape also. Verse 14, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And this is where I want you to see. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? What we see there in verse 14 as this story builds to a climax, and we will not read through the rest of the story, we know and understand that Mordecai convinced Esther to answer the call. And we will see in just a second that she risked her life and that it did work towards the salvation and deliverance of the Jews. But what we see there in verse 14, where it says, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? What we see is a time and a place with a purpose for Esther. Now, it says this, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? If Esther had the choice to come to the kingdom, do you think she would have chosen to come in the manner that she entered into the kingdom? Through captivity, through loss of family, through being pulled away from the only family that she knew? If it were up to Esther, this is not an appointment that Esther made for herself. Mordecai himself would have had no desire to send Esther into the kingdom in the manner that she was taken. Right? I mean, if my daughter was living at that time and the king made the decree and his footmen came and said, give me your daughter so that we can take her and present her before the king, you know what I would say? Not my daughter. Mordecai did not make this appointment for Esther. Mordecai did not make this appointment and say, hey, Esther, go that way. This is great, fun, and exciting. This was not an appointment that he made for her. This is an appointment that was made in such a way that it was done through the providence of the creator of all the universe, with the knowledge and understanding of knowing that it was necessary and there was a purpose for it. In the only way that he could know. Such a time as this. This was an appointment that God made for Esther, and he made all the arrangements for it to happen himself. Now, Esther was there. The question is what was she going to do with that appointment? When she was put up against it, and when her life was on the line, was she going to fill the appointment, or was she going to make it? She was in the place where she was supposed to be at the time that she was supposed to be there, and God had a purpose for her to accomplish, and was Esther going to fill that appointment? Now, as we look at this ourselves, we can stop and understand that we have divine appointments that God sets for us in our lives also. Places where God wants us to be, and times that God wants us to be there, because there is a purpose that he wants us to fulfill in that time and in that place, and in that divine appointment. And there are efforts that we can make to try to avoid those things, but it is in our best interest that we would fill those appointments and not miss them. That regardless of what the cost or regardless of what the circumstances might be, that we would embrace and accept the circumstances of life that God has divinely appointed to us, and that we would trust in him and do as he is calling upon us to do to fulfill his purpose and his will. Now, in Esther's circumstances, her divine appointment was made for the salvation of her people. For the Jewish people, for her kindred, for her cousin who took her in as a daughter, for even herself. Her appointment was made so that a whole nation could be saved. The question for you and I is, what are the appointments in our life made for? The divine appointments that God sets up for us, who is he setting them up for so that we might help and we might encourage and we might strengthen and maybe even save somebody with? Because as we stop and we consider the divine appointments that are in our life, if we miss those appointments, the question is, who will pay the price for our failure? Who will suffer for our failure? Who will suffer for us missing the appointments that God has set for us? Who will perhaps die and go to hell? Or who will be drowned in the circumstances of life and overwhelmed and not receive the encouragement and the strength that is there for them if we would only be where we're supposed to be in the time that we're supposed to be there and doing what we're supposed to be doing. These are three very simple things. I want to encourage you today, don't miss your divine appointments. The first is this. I want you to stop and understand that we always need to be ready. Always be ready in life. Stop and consider this, that Esther was in a strange land. She was in Babylon. She was in Shushan. She was not in Jerusalem. She was not in the regions of Israel. She was in a strange home during this divine appointment. She was not in the home of Mordecai, where she grew up. She was not in the home of her kindred. She was in the king's palace, a strange and a foreign home. She had a strange name. Her name was Hadassah, but she was given the name Esther so that her identity could be hidden. She was with a strange people. Instead of being with her kindred and instead of being with her friends and her family, she was with the strange people in the palace and with the princes and their wives and those who would minister and serve in the palace, along with the king himself, with the strange people. She had a strange job title. She was the queen of a heathen nation, husband to a heathen king. I mean, this is unheard of for a Jewish person. Not only that, but she was living a strange life. You know what this sounds like? This sounds like everyday life for you and me. Because you know what we are? We are Christians. We are born-again believers. And this world is not our home. We're just a passing through. We are citizens of heaven. And it's easy for us to meet the appointments that God sets for us when we go about the religious duties that we are supposed to fulfill, like going to church, right? A lot of times we think God is going to use us when we go to church, or maybe some church-sanctioned activity, maybe some outreach opportunity, maybe the community chicken barbecue or kids' country fair. And it's in those times when we are living our faith in a very real and tangible way that we think those are the moments when God is going to use us, when God is going to accomplish something through our lives, because we're giving ourselves over to him. But yet when we step foot outside of church, or when we go ahead and we kind of just experience life as it is, the mundane, monotonous routines of life that have no spiritual significance to them at all, like going to work, right? There's nothing spiritual about that. There's nothing about going to work that pertains to our faith, or doing yard work, maintaining our car, or going out and about and going to the grocery store. These are places where we are just living and existing in a world that is not our home, that we are just passing through, just like Esther herself was. You know what? And when Esther found herself in a completely unrecognizable environment that had no significance to her kindred, to her faith, to her God, her religion, or her faith, it was in these moments when God made a divine appointment for her to save her people. And you know what she needed to do? She needed to be ready. She needed to be ready. This is someone, you got to stop and realize, this is someone who could not go to temple, or who could not go to the synagogue and worship, and who could not, at least outwardly and publicly, worship and pray to her God. This is someone who had to hide her identity completely. Yet in the midst of all that, God had a divine appointment for her that God set up so that her people could be saved. This is like everyday life for us when we find ourselves smack dab in the center of worldly existence. Some of the greatest divine appointments that God makes for you are when you least expect them and in places that you least expect them. It could be in Barnes & Noble when you're drinking some coffee and you're not thinking about God or Bible or anything at all. It could be at the mall when you're shopping. It could be at your workplace. It could be at an airport or in an airplane when you're sitting in your seat. It could be at the grocery store or at the ballpark when you are rooting on your favorite team. It could be at the restaurant or in the library or when you're on vacation. That God makes a divine appointment for you, where he wants to use you to help somebody else. And the question is are you going to be ready? Now listen, I like vacation probably more than anybody else does in this room. And if you like vacation a lot, that just means that I like it that much more. And you know what? When we go on vacation, we get in the mindset of, don't bother me and don't interrupt me. What happens, though, when God brings you across somebody's path and makes a divine appointment for you to witness to somebody or to encourage somebody or to strengthen somebody? Will you fill that appointment? Will you be ready? The Bible says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. Always be ready. Don't ever let your guard down. Don't ever think that you are in such a way or in such a place where God can't or won't use you, because he can use you wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whatever time it is. And you have to be ready, just like Esther was. Not only that, but don't despair of life. Don't despair of life. Think about Hadassah's life. She was born into captivity. She had no mother or father. She was taken from her only family, her cousin Mordecai, when she was taken to be presented before the king. Again, her name was changed, her identity was hidden, and her people were doomed. Now, if anybody had some rough circumstances to experience, it was Esther. Esther, without question, had every opportunity to give up on hope, to give up on God, and to give up on life, to despair. But you know what? Some of the greatest divine appointments that God makes for you are in the midst of the trials and troubles of life, just like God's divine appointment for Esther, which was in the midst of one of the most difficult and challenging times of life that she could have ever experienced. Stop and think about that. Some of the greatest divine appointments that God makes for you are when you're at your wit's end. Some of the greatest divine appointments are when you seemingly are without hope and have nowhere to turn, when you have nowhere to go. It's when you get a flat tire and you're on the side of the road and you're late for an appointment and you don't know what to do. This happened to me and some boys while we were down in Pensacola, Florida. We got a flat tire when we were going somewhere, and as we stopped, while the guys were fixing the flat tire, someone else, a young man, stopped to see if he could give us some help. But we had it under control. In that moment in time, I had the opportunity to witness to that fella. And you know what happened? I kid you not. He prayed and asked God to save him right there and then on the side of the road. You know when that happened? After we got a flat tire and after we were late for wherever we were going. You know what we are tempted to do when we are caught in the despair of life? We are tempted to just throw up our hands and to give up, and to find no purpose and to find no meaning in the circumstances that we are in. You know what we ought not to do, though, because of the divine appointments that God makes for us? We ought not to despair of life. God may have a divine appointment for you in the hospital bed. He may have a divine appointment for you in the auto shop waiting room, when you just found out that the bill is $858.30. He might have a divine appointment for you when you're at the temp agency because you just lost your job and you don't know what you're going to do to pay your bills. He may have a divine appointment for you at the rehabilitation center. Wherever it may be, you fill in the blank. God may put you in a place at a certain time with a purpose. And the encouragement to you is to do the same thing that Esther did, is to not despair of life. The Bible says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, it says, "For we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble, which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life. But we had the sentence of death in ourselves." Have you ever been pressed out of measure above strength and tempted to despair of life? In those moments, you know what you need to do? You need to trust in the true and the living God. And you need to stop and you need to ask yourself, why am I here? And what can God do in this moment? Why am I in this place at this time? And you need to not despair of life, but only trust in God. And I know it's late. We've taken a whole lot of time up this morning, but I just want to say this in closing is don't hold back. Don't hold back. Look at Esther chapter 4. Look at what it says in verses 15 and 16. It says in Esther chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, "Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer." This is after Mordecai has said to Esther, "Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" She says, "Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink these 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish." She says, you know what? If I die, I die. But I am in this place at this time for a reason. And she says, you know what? I am going to put my life not just in the king's hands, but in God's hands, if perchance God might use me to bring salvation and deliverance to the Jews. Esther was willing to lay it all on the line, even her own life, for just the chance that her people might be saved. Some of the greatest divine appointments that God makes for you will cost you something. And the question is, are you willing to pay the cost? Are you willing to sacrifice what is necessary to fill your divine appointments? Are you willing to sacrifice money? Are you willing to sacrifice time, pleasure, entertainment, pride, freedom? Are you willing to sacrifice your life? What is the price that would keep you from somebody else's salvation? For Esther, there was nothing. She was willing to give it all up. You know what? Sometimes we just can't be bothered to help other people. And sometimes in those moments and in those circumstances, we just don't want to give up our time. We don't want to give up our enjoyment, our experiences. But yet in those times, perhaps God put you in that place and in that time to help somebody. But it's going to come at a cost. What's the price that you would look at somebody else and say, you know what? They're not worth it. Because that's what we do when we miss God's divine appointments. We essentially say, you know what? They're not worth it. I'm more important. My happiness, my satisfaction. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. There is nothing that we should hold back for ourselves that would lead to the expense of other people suffering and hurting and drowning and maybe even dying and going to hell. Nothing. Just as Esther didn't hold back and laid it all on the line. Turn to Esther chapter 8. This is the potential that you have to experience when you meet God's divine appointments. When you step up and you answer the call, just as Esther did, when she had a divine appointment made by God. Notice what it says in verse 15. The story ends well. If you want to find the details, I encourage you to go back and to read through the entire book and to get even more than what we have looked at. But look at what it says in verse 15. After Esther stepped up and after she was able to help provide deliverance and salvation to the Jews, it says that Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white and with a great crown of gold and with a garment of fine linen and purple. Notice what it says. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Now, if we go back just a few chapters, the city of Shushan was perplexed. But because Esther stepped up and accepted the divine appointment, Shushan is now rejoicing and is glad. And look at what it says in verse 17. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast. And then look at what it says. I love the wording that God puts in the Bible. A feast and a good day. A good day. Who here likes good days? Sometimes I just want just give me a good day. Can we just have a good day, please, right? When things are going crazy and things are hard. Look at what it says there. As a result of Esther not missing this divine appointment, instead of the Jews weeping and wailing and being dressed in sackcloth and ashes and fasting, instead, they have joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And not only that, but look what happens. And many of the people of the land, they became Jews. For the fear of the Jews fell upon them. The potential that God brings in your life through divine appointments will just blow your mind. You will change someone's eternity. You will change someone's life. You will perhaps change a family's circumstances for the better. You will draw someone in a closer relationship with God, and it will only result in joy and in gladness and in a good day. And oh, by the way, where people might actually believe and put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ and call upon the name of the Lord. But you know who it's up to make sure that they don't miss those divine appointments? It's up to you and me. And I want to encourage you this morning. I want to encourage you to always be ready for God's divine appointments. Always be ready. Don't despair of life. Don't give up, because in the most difficult and trying circumstances in life is when God can do the most amazing things, not just for you, but for other people. And not only that, but don't hold back. Don't hold anything back from God that he wouldn't be able to use to be able to help somebody else, to be able to lead a soul to Christ, to be able to encourage and to strengthen somebody. Don't miss God's divine appointments in your life. All right, let's go ahead and stand for prayer.